Hello and welcome to the 41st episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Robrousseau, who is the co-host of the Insurgents podcast, hosts a daily live stream show on Twitch, TRRSlive show, and has brought back his podcast, the 49th Parahell. In this episode, him and I talk about various aspects of the situation going on in Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, the escalation of violence, the propaganda, both in the West and from Israel regarding this topic, how it doesn't land with people the way it maybe did in years past and why that is. Talk about what people should do in these situations and the context of Canada's complicity in this along with the United States. And a lot of different things surrounding this topic in general. So I really appreciate that Rob came back on so quickly, about 9 episodes back. We talked for the first time just about his general music growth and also his delving into politics in general. So you can go back and listen to that if you are coming to this for the first time. But I really appreciate Rob's voice on this and his opinions and his insight on this ever-growing topic with the escalation of violence for Palestinians. If you want to follow the podcast, if you're a new listener, make sure to follow at thepowerlesspod on all social media. Email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com. Get in contact with me there. Make sure to leave a review on all podcast platforms, preferably 5 stars, but if not, put what you honestly think of it. And I just hope you really enjoy this episode. Make sure to follow Rob at Robrousseau. We're also going to still play a clip at the beginning here of his music project Hurstwood, as well as a full song at the end, just because I think Rob's music is pretty underappreciated, even by himself. I think he underrates himself with how good this music is. So there will be a clip right after this and a full song at the end. I hope you enjoy this episode, and you'll be hearing from Robrousseau right after this.
Don't ever say it's just a matter of time till we get through tonight. I'll see you around the end of the line. It feels hopeless, but I'm willing to try. Pick me up anytime. At least just try to keep me in mind. Missing your love has got me ready to cry. When you say it's just a matter of time.
So I'm here with Robrousseau, who is the co-host and producer of the political commentary podcast, The Insurgents, hosts a daily streaming show, the TRRSlive, or the Robrousseau Show. And I was pretty stoked to see that you brought back the 49th Parahell podcast as well, which is pretty cool. Obviously, unfortunately, I remember I went back and listened to the podcast you and I had done just like 10 episodes ago from this recording, where I said, hopefully I'd have you back on sometime and some of the things we were talking about would be better. And that is obviously not the...
we could just shoot the shit about music or something. Yeah, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be great. But unfortunately, your show, everything else I've been paying attention to myself with independent reporting, and everything in between is obviously with what's going on with Gaza, Palestine, the ongoing and constant occupation and apartheid, along with, violent escalations with just carpet bombing. And, that's like in a way, the most like normal side of war that we're talking about in this. There's just horrific things you can see that I'll go into a little bit of detail with you on here. But I just wanted to bring you on because I've had on a few other people. I've had on a political activist and a writer for things like Press TV. I've had on Mac, Good Politic Guy, who's another, political commentator that has been talking about this quite a bit to shed light on it as the most important thing, I think, going on politically, globally, with world issues and just humanitarian values and everything else. But I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on kind of the propaganda aspect of what's been going on with this. Obviously we will talk about it in a general sense. what we've kind of seen. I haven't talked too much to either one of those people that I've talked to recently about what's been going on with elected officials, which is not like what I like to necessarily um focus on like in general when I talk about politics, but I think it's important right now with both Canada, the United States, and a lot of other countries in the West with how they've been handling this and why it's just not ringing with people. I think the way that it has in the past to some extent at large with like war propaganda and war, mongering, I guess. So, after all of my rambling there with that, Rob, you've been talking about this a lot, both on your daily show, from what I'm able to catch, and your podcast that I listen to pretty consistently. Overall, like what is your sense as of now? We're recording this on December 5th. I just want to say that because things change so quickly with these things. Um, what's been your sense just with how things are going, both in general with the escalation of violence and just how you're handling covering these things so endlessly, not to make it about two white guys talking about
Yeah.
the Palestinian conflict, but you know what I mean, what's your headspace at as someone who covers these things for a living and pays attention to a lot of this daily.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back on the show, by the way. But a couple thoughts here. Number one, I think over the last 2 months or so, what we've witnessed is truly one of the most depraved things I think I've ever seen in my life. I've been paying attention to this stuff for about 20 years, I guess now, and we went through Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and the whole Obama administration drone policy and the war in Yemen and Syria. Like we've seen some pretty horrendous things going on, but I think this might be truly the most depraved thing. It's almost incomprehensible. The scale of violence being like directed towards civilians, directed towards children, um, and the kind of like sort of open and unapologetic way that that's being done and being completely subsidized by the United States, by Canada, the UK, Germany, Australia, like the whole rules-based international order. It's honestly just stunning to me. Over what we've seen over the last 2 months, just having this captive population of over 2 million people, and just repeatedly dropping thousands of bombs on these people, and with the like I was saying, the open and deliberate efforts to collectively punish civilians for what happened on October 7th. It's just absolutely sick and extremely depraved. Well, I was just going to say, I guess one thing, it's hard to look at a moment of just profound horror like we're seeing right now and try to find positives in it. It does seem like a shift has happened where I think for years, I think people have been sort of unable to or unwilling to really take a strong stand on this. And every single time there's an uptick in violence, it's not like this is a new phenomenon. There's the Great March of Return. There's been repeated, bombing campaigns in Gaza over the years, like since it's been occupied, which the Israelis call mowing the grass, which is in and of itself horrendous. But and the way that Israel has been able to escape kind of criticism or culpability, wielding these accusations of anti-Semitism, using this kind of victimhood narrative when they're the aggressive party. I mean, this has been a really successful kind of strategy for them to kind of escape accountability for their various crimes over the years. And it just seems like for a lot of people this time, and it's kind of like a dam that's been breaking, but it's so egregious, the brutality of and the dehumanization, and all of these kind of these rhetorical sort of tactics that they've traditionally used to escape from that kind of criticism, it just doesn't really seem to be landing on people anymore. Some people definitely. I don't want to say this is a universal thing, but this is especially a generational thing where it just seems like especially young people are just completely rejecting this narrative. And I feel like there's been this sense of frustration on the part of Israel and its enablers and its supporters. You know, I think they thought that on September 7th they could just wield these accusations about the Israel's 9/11, and you know, if you're going to support Palestine right now, you stand with Hamas and you support the terrorism and you support basically ISIS. They're ISIS, they're Nazis, every bad thing that you can imagine. And that's been a way that they've tried to stifle criticism, speech, protest, and people just haven't listened to it. People are just not allowing themselves to be intimidated out of doing the right thing in this situation. And you've seen what amounts to a global mass movement, despite all these threats and despite all these the ways that they've tried to delegitimize this. You have Germany, for example, trying to criminalize some of these protests. You've seen certain slogans be accused of being genocidal or anti-Semitic. You saw someone in Calgary, Alberta, Canada get arrested for saying "from the river to the sea" at one of these protests, which is, if you've been to one of these protests, you'll know is chanted at every single pro-Palestine protest and has been for quite some time. And people are just refusing to be intimidated, and people are continuing to protest. They're continuing to speak out, and there's just this sense that the narrative that Israel has always been kind of in full control of, which is kind of laundered through our media and our political class, it seems like they've kind of lost control of that. And it's as horrible as this moment is, that's something that I feel like in this moment has made me feel a little bit more optimistic or hopeful that potentially this horror can eventually be stopped.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've been trying, because I've just in my own I don't do this for a living. This is something that I do like after my usual job and after
Your
my
real
other
job,
usual
yeah.
job and all that. Oh, it's all real, right? but I mean, like,
Well,
but you
sometimes
know
I
what I
don't
mean,
know.
in the sense of like I have, just anecdotally, for somebody that doesn't do necessarily political commentary or a podcast or whatever else, for for my full-time gig, I talk to people that I either just speak to through social media or people that I knew in college or people that I work with that, generally I would say are less politically, their brain hasn't been melded by like years of just constantly keeping up with the news like mine has to the varying extents. And this is the first time that I've seen those people by and large and across, I mean, statistics are different, but like just anecdotally across kind of age, um, like generations, I guess, that it's the first time that I'll get a message or I'll hear somebody say at work or whatever else that like this doesn't add up for me. Like I don't, people that were in the military or people that are like very military families, or I work in a conservative um rural district of the state that I live in, and even a lot of those people are still, disillusioned in various extents of what's going on because um and I was going to say this to what I think of this, and then I kind of want to get your opinion on this. I think it's a little obvious, but I'd still kind of want to hear your opinion on it. Of I think it's that people by and large like that are even from the sort of boomer generation or Gen X or millennials, whatever else. They're still at this point in 2023 people that are glued to their phones, just like younger people, right? And like for a long time, people sort of talked about social media and that kind of like addiction to technology as a bad thing. And there's a lot of aspects of that outside of politics that's very true. But when you can have somebody across age ranges that can see literal videos of just like, I'm sure you saw as an example, just an anecdote, but I think that's what connects to people, unfortunately, not statistics, um, is of like a 13-year-old girl in the rubble calling for people to save her family before her because like they're so used to this trauma, they're so used to this violence that like a 13-year-old kid is able to like handle that better than anyone we would ever know in our lives in America or Canada, right? just like seeing things like that and the reality of it and being able to connect it to your own life, I think is big importance for people compared to, say, like the war propaganda that we had on our end with Iraq and Afghanistan, where, obviously in the United States, there was a lot of war frenzy post 9/11. There was a lot of bloodlust there. There was a lot of like, this is a tragedy, which I'm sure we can connect a lot to Israel right now as well. That there's a lot of this like, something terrible happened to us, bomb them kind of deal. But when you see the reality a lot more just on the ground in real time, that you otherwise had to see through the scope of like a CNN or, a Fox News or an MSNBC or, I'm drawing a blank on the Canada version of that right now, but
CBC.
I thought that was right, but there's all these 3-letter things. I don't know.
Yeah.
But when you don't have to see it through that lens anymore, and it's not just like niche populations across political spectrums that are not consuming that, it's everybody now. I think that makes a big difference. Do you agree with that? What do you think the kind of difference is now with people by and large? Why like there's obviously there's a big portion of the population that still eats that up, but why is it that these same sort of tactics that worked in the past when it comes to, public consensus on war and violence and tax dollars backing these horrific things happening, half a world away on our ends, why is that not landing with people the same way it did, by and large, with few exceptions, with previous, Middle Eastern conflicts backed by the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the number one reason is that it's just indefensible. And like, I think there's a fundamental contradiction in suggesting that what happened on October 7th is just so awful, and no matter what Israel has done, there's no justification, there's no excuse to target civilians in any kind of counterattack. And there's a real tension or a kind of contradiction in trying to make that kind of claim to delegitimize whatever happened. And I'm not someone that's going to sit here and deny that terrible things happened on that day. I do have I think the narrative about it, that it was just this entirely, this orgy of indiscriminate violence against civilians, is not totally accurate. And there's a lot of questions about what exactly happened on that day, like what the actual number of people that were killed, how many of those people were in the IDF at IDF checkpoints and military bases, which are, legally correct and also morally correct for people that are being subjugated and colonized to attack. I would like to know the figures of who was killed in some of these. We've heard reports in Israeli state media, by the way. I always like to preface this when we talk about this. This is not some kind of like conspiracy or whatever. These are all accounts and testimonies that are coming out in Israeli state media about tank crews firing on kibbutzes where people were hiding, about Apache helicopters firing on vehicles that were driving away from this music festival, crossfire with the IDF. I'd like to know more information about that. But again, that's not to suggest that no civilians weren't targeted or harmed on that day, which is obviously a horrifying thing. But if your position is that no, it's immoral and indefensible, no matter what Israel's responsible for, to target civilians, well, then you can't turn around and murder 20,000 civilians in Gaza as open and unapologetic retribution for that. I mean, it's just completely preposterous, And I think most people, even people that consume mainstream media, can understand that kind of contradiction. They're not buying this kind of excuse. And you see these Israeli officials going on and talking about targeting these hospitals and talking about how the doctors are Hamas and the nurses are Hamas and the patients and the UN schools are Hamas. And they're kind of going out there and making this case. They're telling people to evacuate certain regions, and then they're bombing the regions where they tell people to go. They tell, like, the whole example is of trying to have people leave the north of Gaza to the south, which they're now bombing right now. They're telling people to go to these UN shelters, and they're bombing those. I mean, it's just, as much as this can be laundered through our mainstream media, and all these justifications can be talked about, and we can, the nonstop like fixation on Hamas atrocities and do you condemn Hamas and all this stuff. As much as our media might be playing that game, I think ultimately the contradiction is just so heightened, to use that kind of Marxist language. It's so heightened that like even people that are really plugged into that media machine can see it. And on that front, as well, as like I said, our media is still very much a part of laundering this and kind of manufacturing consent for it. But I definitely do think there's also been a shift where it's not quite as one-sided as maybe as it once was. And I think even in mainstream media, even as they're kind of implicitly supporting this and manufacturing consent for it, there's still, I think, more of a willingness, at least as long as I've been paying attention to this issue, to actually talk to Palestinians about this, to actually try and ask difficult questions to these Israeli spokespeople. You have people like Piers Morgan or whoever having on, Hassan Piker or a number of people that have gone viral in these clips to talk about this. I think this is something that, even a couple of years ago wasn't really happening as much. So, like you said, it's a couple of things. People have access to social media. They're seeing just if you are scrolling your phone, you can't avoid this nonstop stream of horrifying images, especially of children being murdered and attacked, buried under rubble. Like you don't, but if you have kids or not, I mean, that's something that should affect any person with like a functioning soul,
Yeah.
And people are seeing that, and they're like I said, there's a contradiction between the justification for this kind of violence, and what the kind of barbarism that we're seeing. And I think there's a little bit more of a willingness in our mainstream media, even if they are complicit in a lot of this, to at least start doing their basic jobs and at least showing people that other perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. And I think, I think your point, especially on like, I was as surprised as anybody. I think not, and I'm not saying this is a pro thing of Piers Morgan or anything.
No, you don't have to hand it to him.
Has ever done, right? You don't have to give it to him. But like the idea of just like because he as an example, he's a guy that's clearly there just to entertain and just there for ratings and just there for surface level things. Like the guy doesn't probably care about anything other than the lining of his own pocket, right? And just the idea that somebody like that brings on people like Hassan or names are terrible for me, but
me too.
I believe the Egyptian comedian, I think he's Egyptian, that has been on there a couple of times, that is absolutely hilarious and just like is a fantastic. It's a fantastic conversation that I never thought I would enjoy something on Piers Morgan as an example. It just goes to show that the tides are turning a little bit there, that that somebody that's that mainstream realizes there's like I don't want to sound like I care about this, but like a market there, right? Like that there's enough opinions out there that care about this, that this would give them ratings as opposed to getting them kicked off the air, right? So I think that's an important point. To switch gears a little bit from the media, because obviously we could talk about that. Like, actually, this is something I thought of while you were saying what you were saying. I think this came out yesterday or the day before with Pramila Jayapal, which there was something that went a little bit viral with her, which you and I can have our big qualms with someone like Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Progressive Caucus and in the House of Representatives. But what she was on air and as an example for both CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, it was a trifecta of American like corporate media. They all either directly had this conversation like they did with Dana Vaush, I think that's her name, and then MSNBC and Fox News both picked it up, of asking her this question about sexual violence with Hamas, and she answered the question, and then they acted like she didn't answer the question because she turned it around to the actual conversation that we should be having about I think, at least according to Euromed Monitor, as of like last I saw, over 21,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, a majority of them civilians, like 8,000 I think it said, confirmed children. And she didn't even bring those specific numbers up, but generally just said, this is a horrible thing that can happen in war. And no one's backing that, like
Obviously,
newsflash.
no one
like
supports
yeah,
that. Yeah, like that's not.
yeah. I think it was Ryan Grimm that I saw on Twitter say, like, are we really having the discourse on what's going on right now being like, oh, you defend sexual violence? Like, this is really where we're at in this conversation. Like, we saw 700 Palestinians die in a single day. Like, this is not, like, it was just so ridiculous. But I guess, like, what do you, I mean, obviously we could come up with some pretty easy answers here, but why do you think, as much as we just talked about, that their rhetoric is not landing? I think this was kind of a good example of, like, it was just so over the line of, like, what you would call, journalism or conversations or commentary. It was just ridiculous. But why do you think that, that they're continuing on with this? They're not acknowledging what, like, Israeli government officials are saying. They're not acknowledging, like, on the ground video of, like, IDF people taking over homes in in Gaza after they've blown them to bits. Like, why do you think that they are still so strongly hanging onto these lines when, like, they can so easily be contradicted within a Google search, or at least within a search on some social media platforms?
I mean, number one, I was really struck by the seemingly kind of coordinated nature of this specific talking point being promoted as this news cycle began. You had the little minute, the brief ceasefire or brief truce where they could do this exchange of hostages. The violence resumes, which was, of course, blamed on Hamas, which is hilarious as well. Like, Israel was they were really ready to extend that permanently until, big bad Hamas forced their hand, forced them to continue bombing Gaza. It's just absolutely preposterous. But so, the violence resumed. Like you're saying, we're like, I've seen numbers as high as like 20,000, 21,000 civilians killed in Gaza. It's absolutely horrible. And it seems like, as like clockwork, as soon as the violence resumed, we get this big full court press from a number of different folks promoting this narrative of trying to revitalize these stories, which have been floating around since October 7th, about these organized Hamas rape gangs. You saw it get brought up in that interview. I saw David Frum mentioning this. War criminal, lying propagandist.
David Frum, the wealth of information that guy is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hillary Clinton today was talking about, was put out a statement about this, or yesterday. So it's honestly striking to me how it seemed like all of a sudden there's some memo went out where people got the note to start talking about this rather than anything else, rather than the absolutely horrendous, inhuman, completely indefensible violence that we're seeing. And it's so cynical. I mean, the idea someone like Hillary Clinton can talk about how that's something that needs to be condemned universally. There's no justification. Yet strangely, Hillary doesn't seem interested in investigating the hundreds of testimonies of female Palestinian prisoners that have talked about being sexually assaulted or raped in Israeli prisons. It's obviously not good for Palestinian women and girls to have bombs dropped on their homes and have their entire families murdered. So, I mean, it's stunningly hypocritical. And I was also really, because I've been really thinking about a lot of these narratives in the context of like colonialism, and the way that these narratives and the way that Israel propagates these kind of narratives about the whole, like, the garden in the jungle, the wagon circle. It's the colonial outpost that's kind of defending Western civilization from these swarthy hordes, of savage barbarian rapists. It's like these are tropes that have been used time and time and time and time again throughout history.
Libya, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Example. Yeah.
On the point of Hillary, like specifically under her watch, this exact charge was made against, about Libya. There's a story about Gaddafi arming Libyan troops with the Viagra so they could carry out these sexual assaults. But yeah, I mean, going all the way back to, like Jim Crow era America, or, the settlement of the American West. I mean, this is the trope that is used. We must use this kind of violence to defeat the savage because they're coming for our virginal women, I mean, our beautiful virginal women. I mean, this is just, you can look through history and just see this over and over and over again. And so I was really interested about how that was, and horrified because it's absolutely so cynical and depraved, but the way that was employed immediately upon the resumption of this kind of violence, when we should be talking about the 20,000 civilians that have been killed, including tens of thousands now of women and children who we're apparently supposed to be caring about in this news cycle. It's just horrid.
Yeah, and to go from that, and obviously, like, that goes back to what we talked about earlier a little bit about just how this stuff isn't landing. I think just by and large, just seeing the, even if you're somebody that believes everything that's been said about what you and I can call a horrific attack on October 7th, and you don't have to condone anything that's happened in that place. I also just feel kind of gross that I feel inclined that I have to say that at this point.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, even give that all aside, we're looking at 21,000, and we know how these things go. To be fair to anybody that's listening that doesn't follow these things as much as even I do, let alone Rob or somebody that does this for their living, like, reported numbers tend to be people that they can confirm the identity of. Like, it's not even the people that are buried under layers that they don't find for months or weeks. We also know that, like,
the number to go up.
And seeing, like, a majority of hospitals have at least been partially destroyed. The whole health ministry in Gaza has been completely eradicated. So, like, when you look at that and you look at the context of how the bombing's gone, like I said the other day, 700 Palestinians killed in 24 hours. It's just like, I can't wrap my mind around the idea of equating these things, and people speak up about that, like you said at the very beginning. I know you've been to a few of the protests in Montreal. I've been to Chicago. It's really great to kind of see that, like, person to person solidarity in the wake of all this, right? But then you have things that happen, like big polarizing cases with actors, as an example of the I forget her full name, even though I'm a fan of the franchise, but, like, the Scream actor that was just sharing UN, what the UN said and getting fired, or, of course, Susan Sarandon getting let go for, again, saying something that, like, people were able to, like, nitpick to make it seem like it was being anti-Semitic, when it was actually just, like, in context, people are all, like, like, marginalized people have it really fucking rough, and like, we're really seeing it just boil over with violence, both on, with anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia is just through the roof with violence both in the States and in the West, along with, obviously, the oppression in Gaza. And those people lose their jobs. They're like, I've been doing little videos here and there that I can for social media, to kind of cater to people that care about this, but maybe don't pay attention to, like, Middle Eastern news outlets like I do, or something like that. And I had shared a video about, actually with what Mac and I had talking about, if you're threatened with your job, like, you need to remember, like, this is people's lives are on the line. Like, it's tough. It's scary. It's happened to me. I had somebody, like, come after me and threaten to talk to my boss a couple of times. And I was like, but I'm correct. Like, so this doesn't, ultimately it's scary, but doesn't matter. But this guy was like, well, what happens if a local news outlet doxes you? And he shared the news source to me, and it was a local news source. I'll say it here. It was called Lakewood Scoop. I don't know exactly where the place was from this guy, but I looked it up, and they had doxed with this guy and, like, a CVS pharmacist for backing, for stating that, Zionism was terrible, and, like, the murdering of children was terrible. And she said, like, one thing they shared was that, like, she said, like, not all Jews are Zionists, and there's plenty of Jews with integrity out there that really don't that really don't agree with this, which you could see from human rights organizations and endless protesting that has happened inside the Capitol of the United States and everything else. And I know it's a tricky thing for people to talk about. I understand people get squeamish because they don't want to lose their fucking jobs. Like, I understand that, but it's also,
and according to U.S. Congress, those anti-Zionist Jews are actually anti-Semitic, according to the resolution that was passed today.
As opposed to John Hagee, that gets to speak at a pro-Israel march that has like talked about that Hitler was good, absurd. Actually, right? Yeah. Just fucking ridiculous. But it is I liked what I forget who you had on your show recently, because you guys put out 2 episodes a week. It's hard to remember all the guests you've had, but I remember you guys talked a little bit about like the new age of McCarthyism, and it really does feel like that, especially when it's high level people in Hollywood. Like, I do think those people kind of get called out for having opinion against the norm to begin with. People that have any sort of platform. But when I heard from this person, I started digging, and I'm trying to write an article about this, but you know how long those things can take, let alone when you work other jobs.
Yes.
But about just like local news outlets doxing everyday people, showing where they work, showing, all these different things, because they have these opinions that, again, are not like overly out there statements, but they're like literally backed by UN like human rights, experts, and, Human Rights Watch, which is, not some out there group by any stretch of the imagination.
It's actually called Hamas Rights Watch. So
yeah. Right. They're all Hamas. Yeah. The WHO is now Hamas as well.
Yeah,
but,
that's right.
But, like it's just, I don't know. It's done, like, as much as I think this has kind of ripped back the veil of colonialism, of imperialism, of money interests, and geopolitical, positioning, and how it really does get this gross. It's still surprising to me that it's this obvious. Do you feel that way? Do you feel like this was kind of expected with this response, or what are your thoughts on that after all my rambling there?
Well, no, but I think one thing that I've talked a lot about is that our kind of Western society and our Western values that we've talked about for decades, I think have been exposed to everyone around the world, like let alone people that live in this society, but to people around the world have been exposed as being completely fraudulent. All our high-minded rhetoric about human rights, about sovereignty, democracy, about freedom of the press. Like, we're seeing Israel not only openly assassinate journalists, target their families, murder their families. Mm-hmm. This is what our greatest ally is doing. And I think, for a lot of people, that's just, that veil has been lifted, and it's never going to be the same for a lot of people in our society and around the world. Like, we're going to go around the world really and lecture people about treating people with respect and human rights and all this stuff. Like, who will ever listen to a word that we have to say about that? And they shouldn't, because we've never had any credibility on this, but whatever little credibility there might have had has, I think, evaporated here. Or, freedom of speech. We talk about freedom of speech and our precious freedom of speech that we have, and the ability to speak out even unpopular ideas. All these free speech fetishists, they always talk about this, right? It's like even and especially unpopular ideas, especially Nazism and fascism, we actually encourage you to say that. I mean, that's what a lot of these free speech people love to talk about, right? But all of a sudden we're seeing that as well, being restricted. The freedom to peacefully assemble, like we said, and people have been doing it anyways, which I think is incredible and inspiring. People are losing their jobs, like high-powered Hollywood people, and like Philadelphia sports writers are just for saying free Palestine. There's numerous examples of this, and it's scary. Like, we all need to pay rent. We need, like, if you have a kid, if you don't have a kid, like we can't afford to be losing our jobs and our careers over this. But I just do think it is kind of an inflection point. We see what people in Gaza are going through right now, and it's a time that I think we have to be a bit brave, and we have to refuse to allow the people that are kind of wielding this power over us to intimidate us out of doing the right thing here. I think that's really important. This climate of McCarthyism that we're talking about, and how this moment has come that I think we really do have to, no matter how scary it is or how uncomfortable it makes us, we got to continue to speak out and do the right thing, regardless what the consequences might be. Like we see these contradictions heightening. We see these kind of fissures forming and these gaps forming, and people are starting to ask questions about that. Like, now is a time when I think we have to kind of like wedge ourselves into those fissures and try and widen them as much as possible, so people can start to see the reality of the kind of ruling class in our societies and how they operate. But like this climate of McCarthyism that you're talking about, and you can go back to like the kind of anti-communist era in Hollywood, like that we talk about with McCarthyism, and really this is only an effective way to suppress speech when a few people are made examples of, and everyone else says, "Oh shit, I don't want that to happen to me. I'm going to make sure I say the right thing." As you saw in the McCarthyist era, you had a whole lot of people kind of like, stopping to be affiliated with any socialist parties. You had like unions purging socialist members so they couldn't be accused of any of that kind of stuff. You had people kind of disavowing their former friends, comrades, colleagues. And you have people kind of frightened into falling in line. And that's it. I think that climate only works is when people can be intimidated like that. And the more people just who totally refuse to allow people to threaten us in this way, the more difficult it is to control the narrative. No matter how intimidating it might be, when you see people get made examples of, and you say, "Oh God, I don't want that to be me." But that's when you make that decision, and I totally get it. I'm not trying to shame anyone or browbeat anyone. I do understand, and I feel the same fear sometimes myself. I have some tweets from October 7th that have been shared a lot by a lot of really nasty people, and a lot of things have been said about me and the things I had to say on that day. I woke up that day and I saw the Gaza prison fence being bulldozed, and I saw these paragliders going and attacking these IDF positions. And anyone that knows anything about what's been going on in Gaza for decades now should celebrate that. And I did celebrate it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the propaganda machine starts getting turned on. You hear the narrative about the atrocities, and people are, I had moments myself where it's like, oh God, people are going to take these tweets, and they're going to hold it against me until I'm, for years now. And, maybe I should apologize. Maybe I should shut up. Maybe I should delete stuff. Maybe I should. And you ask yourself these questions. So believe me, I get it. But I guess over the last 6 weeks, 2 months or so, that's just been my feeling, is that we take away their power to control us when we just refuse to give in to these kind of campaigns of intimidation. And so that's one thing that I've tried to continue to do. I hope that that's, been an example for maybe some people, that we can say these things and they're not crazy for believing these things, and they're actually normal for being horrified by what we're seeing right now. Not only are they normal, but like you look around the world, like overwhelmingly the global population stands with the people of Gaza. It stands with Palestine. And when we take that stand, we're standing with the overwhelming majority of the entire population of the world, as much as we can feel like this is some kind of fringe or extremist position sometimes in our society. So I think that's how we can kind of take the power away from people that want to intimidate us, is just by refusing to allow that to happen.
And I don't mean to take too much more of your time. I appreciate you coming on kind of late at night to do this with me after your I'm sure long day of the content creation.
The content mines,
endlessly, in the content mines, But one thing I did want to ask about, again, I don't like to make these things about this because I'm pretty disillusioned from electoral processes. But
sure, yeah.
What has the consensus been from Canadian electorate officials, whether it's the NDP, the Labour Party, the Conservatives? I can't imagine it's too much more out of line than like the Israel line when it comes to the Conservatives, maybe in the Labour Party. But what has been the overall positioning from Canadian elected officials, and what do you know of in the details of what they've been providing for Israel in this time? I think I saw something like they do like $200 million worth of ammunitions to Israel. I could be off on that. I don't know the specific numbers, but what's kind of your sense of the the messaging there and the support there.
I mean, I don't have the figures of like what
Right.
the ammunition that we're sending.
Yeah,
or the
I
funds.
didn't.
I think,
to be clear, I didn't mean to ask that as like you being the token Canadian expert being Canadian to answer
no, but
this question.
I think what Canada has been offering at this time, though, is just the diplomatic cover. And we're in complete lockstep with the Biden administration on this. Like, it's all the same rhetoric, the same thing we hear all the time, which is another thing that people are starting to reject as well. This perpetual right to defend itself that Israel has. They have the right to defend themselves. That's another contradiction I think people are starting to pick on here, where it's like, well, why do they have the right to defend themselves, but the Palestinians don't have that right? Apparently, they can't protest. We can't do BDS. We can't do targeted boycotts. You can't do the Great March of Return, where you peacefully march to the Gaza prison fence. People are shot by sniper bullets or intentionally maimed for life. I mean, it's been decades of this, and every single form of resistance is criminalized, is attacked with violence. It's demonized. It's called anti-Semitic. It's all these strategies are used. So that's one thing that I think people are picking up on as well. But this is what Canada's been saying. It's been in total lockstep with the Biden administration, talking about their right to defend themselves, with maybe a little similarly to what's happening with the Biden administration, a little bit of liberal moralizing or hand-wringing about the violence, how we expect them to follow international law and all these kind of qualifiers, which they're obviously not doing. And anyone with eyes can clearly see that any respect for international law is not being followed in any way. There is no effort being made to protect civilians or anything that our governments are saying. But I think ultimately that's more what it's about. It's been about a diplomatic relationship. We have a deep partnership with Israel as well, just as the United States does, because we're also settler colonies. That's why we get along, because Israel is a settler colony in the Middle East in the same way, and was settled in the same way as Canada and the United States were. But it's happening in a kind of modern context where we can kind of witness the violence of that and the depravity of that. So I think that's just been the main way that Canada supported them. The Conservative Party I think they're criticizing Trudeau and the Liberals for not being pro-Israel enough and being kind of stealth Hamas sympathizers or whatever, despite them doing absolutely everything that they can to bend over backwards and support Israel's perpetual right to commit this like absolute atrocity. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the NDP, and I think like there's people in the NDP that have tried to take a decent line on this. There's people in the NDP that are calling for a ceasefire, but I think one perfect example of how the NDP repeatedly fails these kinds of moments was with the case of Sarah Jama, who is a member of provincial parliament in Ontario, who was removed from the caucus on the days after this happened, put out a statement that correctly, and it was a very morally brave statement to make, but correctly framed the violence that happened under the context of the apartheid system that's been in place for decades. And talked about that kind of context and the way that the occupation and this apartheid system and settler colonialism in Israel has to end. This is an idea that in our political system or in our media has been just completely forbidden to talk about. And like you said, I think this is something that makes people really uncomfortable, especially when the propaganda machine gets turned on and we hear all the atrocity stories, whether it's beheaded babies or roving Arab Hamas rape gangs, whatever it is. But I know it makes people uncomfortable, but I think that's always been how I've tried to understand whatever violence. It's not suggesting that civilians weren't targeted on October 7th. I think the story is a lot more complicated than it's made out to be. That doesn't mean that civilians weren't targeted. It doesn't even mean that there weren't cases of sexual violence. Like, we don't know. Like, we don't really have any way of proving that. I dispute certain narratives about this story about organized mass rape gangs being completely being promoted with zero evidence, or these kinds of atrocity stories that we've heard. But it doesn't mean that this kind of violence didn't happen. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be horrified by that kind of violence, especially when it's visited against civilians. I've always just tried to frame that kind of violence in the context of colonialism and apartheid, and liken that to similar incidents that we've seen in slave uprisings, the Nat Turner slave uprising, Haiti, Vietnam, the Indian Mutiny, the settlements of the American West. Like, we've seen this time and time again, this kind of violence of people that are being colonized and exploited reacting with kind of violence that sometimes does target innocent people. It's horrifying, but you have to frame that and put the responsibility on the people that are perpetuating that system of apartheid. That's what's causing that kind of violence. That was the kind of statement that, maybe not quite that level, but that's kind of what Sarah Jamal was saying in her statement on the days afterwards. And she was accused, obviously, of being a anti-Semitic terrorism supporter.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than stand with her, the Ontario NDP caucus threw her under the bus, basically eliminated her from the caucus. And since then, they've tried to have this stance where, we stand for a ceasefire and we want to have peace and talk. But it's like they kind of jettisoned all their credibility by not just unequivocally standing with Sarah Jamal in that moment. So I think you can say a lot of our more social democratic political leaders at this time, even if some of them have tried to take stances on this, ultimately, I think it's been not enough. And I think, like we saw with Pramila Jayapal, I think this is part of the whole strategy of do you condemn Hamas and do you condemn this atrocity and that atrocity? And when you start getting on the defensive like that, even when you're trying to, this has been my observation anyway, even when you're trying to take a pro-peace stance, a pro-ceasefire stance, you kind of undercut your own position when you play this respectability game. And you say, yeah, of course I condemn Hamas and I condemn all the atrocities. And, there's no excuse, there's no justification. And every single horror story that you hear, yeah, no, obviously that's very bad. But I think ultimately then when you're in a position where you're making this argument, you're undercutting your own position when you're saying we need to have a ceasefire, we need to have peace against this horribly violent, barbaric enemy, which I have just agreed is worthy of all this kind of condemnation. This is how I think this kind of social democratic position ends up getting kind of undermined. And that's one thing that I think people need to understand, the way that rhetorically, the way that kind of works. And as difficult as it is, when people start hurling these accusations of you saying you support this and that, ultimately you're not really taking a pro-peace position or a position where you're a coherent position when you're agreeing with all this entire premise that this attack was totally unjustified and barbaric and violent and all this stuff. I think it's you can't really have it both ways. And as difficult as it is, no matter where you are right now, you have to take a firm stance on one side of this.
Well, and it reminds me of, and I'll leave it here. I'll probably just ask you one more question here, and maybe ask where you think people can go that feel strongly about this and don't know exactly what to do afterwards, right? But it reminds me of I went back and watched Gaza Fights for Freedom, made by Abby Martin, just the other week when this kind of started. I guess this has been going on for 2 months, like you said now, Jesus.
I was really proud. I was proud I was able to talk to Abby in 2018 when she put out the film on the podcast, their previous podcast. It was really illuminating me. And it's something I've been increasingly radicalized on for the last couple of years, but that film is just absolutely so harrowing and really just totally indefensible when you look at the facts of what happened.
Well, right. It's like you do literally the most peaceful kind of activist protest to stand for your own legitimacy, to stand for against occupation, to stand against this open air prison that you're put into. And the stark reminder, and I encourage anybody that's hearing this, even if you disagree with everything that Rob and I have said, although if you're at this point, you would have turned it off probably at this point. But
kudos to you if you're just mad.
If you're just hate listening to whatever.
You made it 53 minutes.
But was the video? I think it was only 20, 30 seconds long that she was able to get from an IDF sniper in that situation. Where it was the scope. I don't know if you remember this, but I'll never forget of them there's little kids putting Palestinian flags into the fence, and I think maybe it wasn't even actually, it was them playing away from the fence, and them sniping them and just joking and laughing about it and looking to see if they could basically double tap, right? And it was and all the instances of the young people that were permanently, if they weren't killed, they were permanently injured and disabled. And I think about those same people in this instance now, like a disabled person in Gaza with, and like I've said to you before, I'm a special
just move to
education
the
teacher.
south.
Well, right, that too. But like I'm someone that works with the most like medically fragile people, and so when I see something like that, and I think about what's been going on right now, just from my own personal worldview with what I do at my job and everything else, like, and I see that, and then it's like those people were gunned down, those people were shot, they're doing something peaceful. What do you think that the message is that you're sending to the people that are occupied in Gaza? They tried the peaceful way.
Yeah.
They tried numerous times. Now, to be fair, there's also been like violent resistance that actually, but that's the reason why for a little while, like, is IDF forces were not constantly inside of Gaza at a certain point. It was intifadas or whatever else that people like to, demonize and everything else, or what happened in the West Bank and in those kind of violent uprisings as well. But it's like, what do you think is going to happen? I don't know. It's like I've said this quote too many times on here when I've talked politics, but there was a comedy duo show from the mid 2000s where the guy was like, I believe in revolution, but without violence. And the guy was like, so by magic, it's like, what eventually, like, what do you think is going to happen when you're so oppressed? You're so, not to make light of the situation, but you're so caught up in violence and oppression, not able to breathe and not able to live and not able to have water or electricity or anything in between. Like, what do you think is going to happen? You brought up like the Nat Turner, slave rebellion. You bring up Haiti, or you bring up what happened in India with the British occupation. And it's like none of those things. No one wants to say like violence against civilians, violence against families, violence against women and children in that respect either, or anything like that was good. No one's saying that, but the context is, how do you end that? You don't end it with bombing to peace. You end it with the end of the systemic violence and occupation. And that's a historical fact. Like Israel and Palestine is not a monolith in the sense of this is some special situation where like we don't know where this is going to go unless you end the occupation, you end the violence, and you end, the secondary, to be nice, the secondary citizenship, right? Like it's just people act like they know history, and then they act like this is normal, and this is not normal. And what the fuck do you think is going to happen? I don't know. It's like, I love the it's been overused at this point, but like the Michael Brooks quote about it's not complicated. It's like, it's really just fucking not, I had a few other things I was going to ask you. We're already at an hour because I talk too much, so I appreciate your time.
I've been doing a lot of rambling too.
No, but I love it. That's what I'm here for. If I talk too much, it's not good. So Rob, the last thing I want to ask, obviously, you're co-host of your podcast, The Insurgents, which I encourage everybody to listen to. Comes out once a week for free, twice a week if you subscribe. He put out a website, pretty simple website for people to be able to access things for a ceasefire, that I think I've been sharing to a lot of people. But what do you think in this context of what's been going on? What do you think people that care about this don't really know what to do? You're half a world away, the United States, Canada, wherever else. What do you think are some steps that people should do in this time to do their part, or to just, feel like they're part of the movement to kind of combat what's been going on?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would just like to preface that by saying that I'm not like Mr. Activist. I've never really tried to pretend to be that. I'm just kind of a dipshit who talks into a microphone. Like you mentioned, I have been to a couple of the protests here in Montreal, which I think that's really valuable. It's really valuable to send a message to our political leaders that we're not going to tolerate this, and that we don't support it. And honestly, I think it's important to send a message to people in Gaza as well, that we're thinking about them and that we're with them. It's like, It doesn't materially change anything, but it's like, I imagine that's a valuable message. Like, even the people that are in the countries that are arming and funding Israel and allowing them to do this are so firmly opposed to it and so firmly with them. I think that's really important. I think there's a lot of people that are just doing incredible activism, like direct action, to go beyond like protesting, direct action targeting these weapons manufacturers to try and hinder Israel's ability to receive supplies. But again, it's hard to encourage people to get involved in that kind of thing because it's dangerous. Like we saw in New Hampshire, that group of people, including Kala Walsh, who's someone that I've spoken to before on my show, who did this direct action at one of these weapons manufacturers, and did some allegedly, did this direct action there, lit like a flare or a smoke bomb, and the way that was framed by people is like firebombing a Jewish-owned business or something, or framing as if they're Nazis or something. And they're facing very serious legal consequences for this. Like, this is serious shit. Like, we're talking like really serious legal consequences. So I don't want to sit here and like tell people to go get arrested and be in jail for the rest of your life over this. But I think there is opportunities to engage in kind of direct action about this, and people can decide for themselves whether that's something that they want to participate in. People have different levels of comfort with that. But I think that's important. And I think, to touch on what I was saying before, I think the really important thing that we can all do is just to refuse to be intimidated in this moment, and to understand that no matter what they throw at us in terms of they're going to say you're an anti-Semite, they're going to say you support terrorism, they're going to say you're a Nazi or whatever it is. We have to understand that we're on the right side of history. The people that stand with Palestine, the people that stand with Gaza are on the right side of history. And we have to refuse to allow them to intimidate us or to move us away from that position. I think for too long, and I would include myself in this, I think we have allowed Israel and its enablers and its supporters to set the terms of this debate and to intimidate people out of speaking out or to dilute their own positions. We saw the way that these kinds of accusations kind of really destroyed the whole Corbyn movement in the UK. These completely bad faith accusations of anti-Semitism, which I think we should all understand now. This is what it was always about. It wasn't about protecting Jewish people. It was always about going after someone who stood up for Palestinians and was could have possibly been in a position of power to materially impact that. That's all what those accusations were ever about. But I know at the time, a lot of people on the British left got intimidated and tried to stand with Corbyn, but also said, okay, but we have to take these claims seriously. We can't appear to be squishy on this or whatever, and kind of undermined their own movement by doing so. So I think that's just one thing that we all need to continue to do, is just to refuse to allow these people to intimidate us. We can't be scared out of moving our position or taking the right the right position on this.
Right.
And that's it might be little. It's sometimes you feel very helpless in these moments. There's obviously this huge disconnect between what actual citizens in both Canada and the United States want and what our governments are doing. They don't seem to be too swayed by these protests, so it does feel helpless. But I think that's, whether it's useful or not, I think it's important to continue to hold firm and to stand with the people of Palestine no matter how difficult it gets.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for going over all this with me, Rob. I appreciate you taking your time more recently than I had expected with having you back on. And again, lastly, where can people find all of your various things that you're doing lately? Where can people find you on socials, or where can people find the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Robrousseau. You mentioned the podcast is the Insurgents. That's insurgentspod.com. I host TRRS on twitch.tv/Robrousseau every single day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Brutal.
And yeah, like you mentioned, when I got started off in podcasting and trying to do this kind of commentary, I started a show called 49th Parahell, where I talked about Canada, I talked about the United States. I tried to kind of bring that kind of like analysis to sort of Canadian politics, which wasn't really happening at that time. I haven't really been doing the show over the last 2 years, but I do a lot of interviews on Twitch, and it occurred to me that it would be kind of cool to have a place for listeners, people that can't tune into the show, for those interviews to live. And also, I realized there's a little bit of a community and an audience for that show that maybe enjoyed listening to it. So I brought that back recently. That's 49th Parahell on all your podcast apps, feeds, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
and that's it. That's all my stuff.
I do got to plug the 49th Parahell one real quick. Like I didn't realize it, but like the first one you put out that both had the Electronic Intifada and who was the other
Justin Potter.
Yeah.
It
got
good Substack.
Yeah, it was an instant, follow of both of those people that now I'm, getting a lot of great material, great insight
Yeah.
from both of those spots. So it's both great conversations, and you have great guests on there. So again, Rob, really appreciate your time. And I really appreciate you going over all these things with me.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me.
You're asking me what's wrong, but isn't it so obvious? So obvious. You say that it's my fault. Well, isn't that just fabulous? So fabulous. In hindsight, it just feels so goddamn obvious. Maybe I'm too far gone, but maybe it's not that serious. So serious. Maybe it's not my fault. Maybe I'm delirious. Delirious. Feels like falling up to the ceiling. Can't stand to relive this feeling. Come down, feels like the first time. In hindsight, it just feels so goddamn obvious. Everything's gone wrong.